Welcome, everyone. We're so thrilled to be together this evening to have this incredibly important conversation. I'm Rabbi Sharon Brous from ICAR, and our topic tonight is how we end the death penalty. We know that there is a groundswell of effort to abolish the death penalty across the United States, and tonight we have really an incredible opportunity to hear from some of the leading voices in the fight for death penalty abolition as we collectively consider the moral and legal lenses on the death penalty. So I'm thrilled to have you all here. This event is co-sponsored by Witness to Innocence, Death Penalty Focus, and ICAR. And for those who are not familiar with ICAR, I'll just say a very quick word about our community. We are dedicated to reanimating Jewish life and helping build a just and equitable society. Our community is centered in Los Angeles, but we have folks really all around the world, and we actively and intentionally work to reflect the vibrancy and diversity of the Jewish people. And we're really rooted in the principle that in a time of turmoil, of uncertainty, of fierce division, communities of faith must stand as voices of moral courage, as sources of spiritual strength, and first responders to injustice and indifference. It is my profound pleasure and honor to introduce to you now my friend who will be our moderator for this evening, Stephen F. Rohde, who is a retired constitutional lawyer. He's a lecturer and a writer and political activist. He was the former chair of the ACLU Foundation of Southern California and the immediate past chair of Bend the Arc, which is a Jewish Partnership for Justice. He's the past president of the Beverly Hills Bar Association and a founder of the Interfaith Communities United for Peace, for Justice and Peace, the ICUJP. Also a board member of Death Penalty Focus. And I want to share tonight that he has represented a California death row inmate, and he was part of the clemency team for Stantuki Williams, who was executed tragically in 2005 in an event that really supercharged my own activism around the death penalty. But I know Stephen originally from Progressive Jewish Alliance, where he really welcomed me into Los Angeles and introduced me to a rich and beautiful world of faith-based activism. And I'm so proud to count you as a teacher and as a friend. Stephen, thank you so much for guiding us in this conversation this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi Brous, Sharon, my good friend. If I was your teacher, then you have learned a lot because I am your student and have learned so much from you. It really is an extraordinary pleasure to welcome everyone who is attending this event because I'm particularly proud of the individuals we've gathered. I cannot think of a better group of people to address the fundamental question of how do we end the death penalty, drawn from three different walks of life and communities. I too want to thank ICAR as our host and wonderful people that have made this possible. Brooke Wirtschafter, Andrea Stern, and Christina Saucedo, who is always there to help Rabbi Brous. We are co-sponsored by Death Penalty Focus, where I serve on the board, and we appreciate the support that Yoko Atani Sperlin, Mary Kate DeLuca, Maddie DeLone have provided from Death Penalty Focus. And Witness to Innocence, an extraordinary organization you'll hear more about from Herman Lindsey during our program. And I'm very grateful to Allison Walsh and Jenny Sheeks for their help in organizing this program and promoting it. The only housekeeping I have for you is that the chat function is disabled, but that questions and answers are welcome in the Q&A feature. You can look down at the bottom of your Zoom screen for Q&A. Put in questions throughout the program, and we will make an effort to address as many of those as we can. Our overall approach will be a few opening remarks from me. We will turn to Herman for his personal story, because unless you put a human face on this abominable form of punishment, many people get lost, and that's why we're so grateful that Herman joined us. We'll turn to DA George Gascon, who has become a friend because of our shared values in justice, equality, progressive prosecutions. And we'll be addressing him and eager to hear his view of the state of the effort to end the death penalty and his work in that regard. We'll turn then back to Rabbi Sharon Brous for a broader look at all of the values that are at stake when communities come together to oppose the truly barbaric notion that the state is going to kill to demonstrate that killing is wrong. We'll have a little conversation among the four of us, and then we'll turn to questions and answers with each of you. We are meeting on a historic day when it comes to the death penalty. It was 49 years ago today that the US Supreme Court, in the historic case of Herman versus Georgia, struck down the death penalty as being cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the 8th and 14th Amendments. This was a day to celebrate for anyone who cares about justice, but it was a short-lived moratorium because 4 years later, in Gregg versus Georgia in 1976, the US Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty, permitting states to pursue executions under the format that has largely existed to this day. So as much as we meet on a day to celebrate the time when there was an abolition of the death penalty, we know that we have our work cut out for us. But I want to tell you that in a range of public policy issues, there is a moment, there is a tipping point on every serious issue this nation has ever confronted. And I think we are at that tipping point when it comes to ending capital punishment. Last week, on June 23rd, a little-known California Committee on the Revision of the Penal Code, a statewide commission approved by our state legislature, passed unanimously a resolution to abolish the death penalty. And they issued an extensive written report cataloging the flaws in the capital punishment system. They concluded, and I quote here, quote, "Eliminating the death penalty is a critical step toward creating a fair and equitable justice system for all in California, as the ultimate punishment is plagued by legal, racial, bureaucratic, financial, geographic, and moral problems that have proven intractable. Intractable. It cannot be reformed. It must be replaced." It's important to note that much has changed since California last examined the death penalty in 2008. 13 years ago, a previous commission found that the death penalty system was a dysfunctional system. Much has significantly changed. Today, a majority of the states in the United States and an overwhelming majority of nations across the world do not have a death penalty either in law or in practice. Here in California in 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom declared a moratorium on executions, and he dismantled the death chamber. More recently, Governor Newsom took the unprecedented step of filing an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, in the California Supreme Court, arguing that the death penalty is unconstitutional and is applied in a racially biased manner. Also, district attorneys such as George Gascon and the district attorneys of Santa Clara and cities like San Francisco and other large California counties have openly declared they will not seek the death penalty. And recently, a group of 100 current and former elected prosecutors, attorneys general, and law enforcement leaders issued a joint declaration that many have tried for over 40 years to make America's death penalty system just, yet the reality is that our nation's use of this sanction cannot be repaired and must be replaced. So there are many findings in this report. Prominent and shameful is the degree of racial bias in our death penalty, which we will discuss today. It is shocking that the race of the defendant and the race of the victim has a significant impact on whether or not the death penalty will be implemented. Despite accounting for only 6.5% of California's population, over 1/3 of the people on death row in California are Black. And while Latinx people account for less than half of homicide arrests in the state, between 2005 and 2019, all 8 of the people sentenced to death in California in 2018 and 2019 were Latinx. We've had 5 documented cases that we know of so far of innocent men on California's death row, barely saved from their executions. And every reason exists that in this state and across the country, innocent people have been executed. 83% of all capital cases have been reversed at the state and federal levels. Let me repeat that. 83% of capital death penalty cases have been reversed at the state and federal systems. In what universe would we accept such a failure rate at such an appalling consequence of death? It alone cries out that this system has failed us. It cannot be repaired. I may offer some other remarks throughout our evening, and I'm eager to turn to our program. Herman Lindsey will tell us his story of the time that he spent on death row for a crime he did not commit. Herman, please tell us that story and the work that you've done to work with other exonerees in an effort to end the death penalty.
First, I would like to thank everybody who participated in this, because this is where change begins. Change begins among us in society, and it's amazing when people get involved. My name is Herman Lindsey, and I'm the 23rd person to be exonerated in the state of Florida. I was arrested for a murder that happened 12 years prior to my arrest. The murder happened in '94. I was arrested in 2006. When I first got arrested, I didn't know what to say. I thought in the system that, a couple of days they'll see that I'm not the person that should be arrested for this crime and I'll be released. It didn't happen like that. Instead, the state moved forward, and after about 6 months of sitting in county jail, going back and forth to court, I asked my lawyer to do a demand for speedy trial, which allows me to have a trial within 90 days. I couldn't sit there for a murder I didn't commit 2 and 3 years awaiting trial. I just couldn't. My motion was granted. In my trial, in 1994, they asked me the question, have I ever been to that pawn shop? And I said, yes, I have. I was completely honest. I told them I had a traffic ticket with a warrant. So I used the alias name and pawned my Sega game. In court, during my trial, they held the paper up and was saying, like, giving the jury the impression that I was there casing the place out 2 months before, prior, when I went and pawned it in a different name. But if I wouldn't have been honest, they wouldn't even seen that pawn slip. I had nothing to hide. I can remember when I first started trial and we was about to pick jury, the state attorney came over to me and offered me 3 years in prison in exchange for a manslaughter charge. I said I couldn't take it. I couldn't take it. You know, I didn't do this. I don't know where I had the guts at, because I didn't have belief in the justice system really then, but I just knew I didn't do anything, so I wouldn't be convicted. So I'm like, no, I wouldn't take it. In my trial, the prosecutor placed on a big screen projector the worst picture of the victim, as the medical examiner talked for 45 minutes, 2 hours. And that inflamed them. That really inflamed them. The second piece of evidence they used against me was my ex-wife, which when she was on the stand, the state attorney and my ex-wife was getting into an argument. And I was like, he's not gonna win, but you know, I was married to her. I know she get an attitude. So, but he told her to tell the truth. She said, if you want me to tell the truth, then I'll tell the truth. And she said that only reason she gave those statements to those detectives was because, one, they were threatening to take her child away from her. Two, they kept harassing her at her job and at her grandmother's house and harassing her grandmother. And three, they basically told her what to say. And that she was expecting a $10,000 reward, which she didn't receive. And next piece of evidence they actually used against me was a guy who in the beginning in 1994 was the prime suspect in the case. For years when the detective went to interview him, he acted like he didn't know anything about this case. Yeah, like he didn't know anything about this case. He kept denying, I don't know about it. In 2005, when the new detective took over and he was doing federal prison time, he turned around and worked a deal with the detective and then said all of a sudden, hey, I remember a guy, Herman Lindsey, was in the holding cell with me and he admitted to committing this crime. With that, I was found guilty. I was found guilty and sentenced to die by lethal injection. I can never forget that day when the judge said, we, the people of the state of Florida, hereby sentence you to die by lethal injection. I couldn't understand what was happening for weeks after I walked in like a numb state because I'm like, I'm finna die for something I didn't do. But thank God, Florida Supreme Court reviewed the case in my direct appeal, and my case came the first case in history where all 7 Florida Supreme Court judges ruled unanimously that I shouldn't have never been convicted. I didn't receive a new trial. I didn't have to go back to court. I was released straight from death row back to my family. And, you know, for a while, it took me a little time to adjust, but I adjusted. And then I got contacted by FADP and Witness to Innocence to come tell my story. And I really didn't want to be bothered, but they offered me an honorarium and I wanted a pair of new Nikes at the time. So I began to speak. I became the secretary of the board of directors for Witness to Innocence. I'm on the board of directors for FADP. For those that don't know Witness to Innocence is an organization based on death row exonerees. Exonerees around the United States, and we travel all around the United States talking with legislators, putting on speaking events, educating everyone that we could possibly educate. And education is very important for the simple fact that how would you like to be the person on my jury and find me guilty and recommend a sentence to death and then find out I'm not the person. You know, that's a big problem in our justice system, is that most people don't want to be on the jury, so they're not paying attention to the evidence. They're not paying attention to what's going on. And to make a decision on someone's life like that is very important. Some don't even understand what a reasonable doubt is. Some cases are open and shut cases. Some cases are much harder. But no matter what the case is, people on the jury needs to really pay attention to the case. It's very important for people that is elected for jury duty to understand and really be educated on the death penalty, because see, the death penalty is not a way of justice, it's an act of revenge. And if you look at it, just about everyone that pushes for the death penalty, I'm gonna say the victim families, most of the victim families that push for the person to get the death penalty, they're pushing out of emotions, they're pushing out of anger, and that's not gonna bring their people back. But the most dangerous thing is that having this death penalty intact is a high risk of killing an innocent man that you cannot bring back. And now we're actually seeing, I think it's a case in Texas, Smith, where he was executed, and now the DNA is saying that he's not the person. And, you know, you cannot bring a person back to life. So the death penalty need an alternative. And I thank everyone for attending.
Thank you, Herman, so much. It is shuddering to think that how close you came on such the absence of evidence. It is unbearable. I'm grateful for your personal strength and the work you're doing, and we'll expand on that in a few minutes during our conversation. It's really a pleasure to introduce DA George Gascon in a time of such cynicism toward elected officials, such disdain so often. George Gascon has an extraordinary career in law enforcement, in Los Angeles, in Arizona, then in San Francisco, former district attorney of San Francisco, where early on he implemented many of the progressive measures that progressive prosecutors around the country are beginning to adopt. Then we in Los Angeles had an opportunity to meet him. He ran against Jackie Lacey, the incumbent district attorney who had presided over death penalty cases, including 20 out of 23 executions from this county. 22 were people of color. George was forthright in his campaign. He was honest and he was candid. He told the voters that he opposed the death penalty and that he would not implement it if he was elected. And voters of California, of Los Angeles, California, elected him. He's been true to his word. On his first day, he implemented a range of reforms. Today, we've asked you, George, to join us to really expand for a few minutes on, given your life experience, your experience in law enforcement and in the role of a prosecutor, what brought you to be so firm in your opposition to the death penalty? What steps you are taking over the course of your tenure here in Los Angeles to pursue that goal?
First of all, thank you, Stephen, for the opportunity. It's always a pleasure to be here with you. And Rabbi Brous, is always an honor sharing the room with you. And Herman, good to see you. We met during the campaign, and it's, listening to your personal story, it's shocking, but it's also an affirmation that what we're doing by opposing the death penalty is not only the moral thing to do, but it's it's just the right thing to do all the way around. But walk you through the reasons why I'm so clearly and steadfast in my opposition to the death penalty. There are multiple factors. Number one, I believe, and by the way, they're not in any particular order or value. I think each of them offers a tremendous amount of value to the conversation. I am a strong believer that part of the criminal legal system, in order to protect our community, is to create interventions that actually deter crime from occurring. And any intervention that we use that does not deter crime from occurring, I believe, is an intervention that should be evaluated to see whether it makes sense at all to apply it. So when you come to the death penalty, is really the ultimate intervention by the government, right? This is the taking of someone else's life. And the evidence, overwhelming evidence for the last several decades, is that the death penalty doesn't deter crime. And the reason why it doesn't deter crime is because when someone takes another life or takes a human being's life, generally they're not thinking ahead of time and saying, oh, well, if I do this, I may end up being executed. That's just not the thought process. Majority of the cases that involve a homicide are driven by emotions, by passion of the moment, by anger, or, in a very few exceptional cases, you may have someone that actually is psychopathic about it, right? And then that, again, that's a whole different human being. But that, again, those are very, very few people. So to begin with, it's an intervention that doesn't have any value in terms of deterring crime. Secondly, and I think that one of the things that we often forget in government is that we in government roles are the stewards of the public budget, the public bank account. We're supposed to be the guardians of public funds and make sure that they are applied in the best and most reasonable way to achieve the greatest good for everyone. And when it comes to the death penalty, we know that it's terribly expensive. It doesn't, the value when you're looking straight through an economic lens, it clearly is not there. In fact, I've heard, and Stephen may correct me on this, but I think if you were to amortize a single execution in California today based on the total cost of the death machine, would be somewhere between $300 and $400 million. Clearly, way out of proportion with any argument that you can make for value. And then Herman really illustrated what I think is, so critical. The system makes mistakes, right? We know that wrongful convictions occur. We know that somewhere around 4 or 5% of all the convictions in this country, eventually we learn it was a wrongful conviction. And the death penalty is irreversible, right? If we execute someone, we cannot bring that person back to the rest of us. And for me, that's an unacceptable risk. And then, as Stephen mentioned earlier today, and many of us are, filing briefs of the court's briefings and talking about it, there's a case in front of the California Supreme Court now where the argument that is being made is precisely that on its application, the death penalty is racist. And certainly LA has been a poster child for this. If Stephen mentioned under the prior DA, 22 out of 23 cases where people were sent to death row, out of, frankly, hundreds of cases that were prosecuted for murder during that period of time, 22 out of 23, there were people of color. And when you look at death row, you can't help but see the disproportionality of the application of the death penalty. So it's not a deterrence. It's horribly expensive. It cannot be fixed if you make a mistake and it's racist on its application. I could go on, but the reality is that there is no way that I know how to fix the death penalty. You can on moral grounds, you cannot on economic grounds, you cannot in, public safety grounds. There's just no approach to it. So what are we doing in LA? And as Stephen mentioned, I very clearly, when I ran for office, I was unequivocal about the fact that I would never seek the death penalty. And not only that, but I actually stood up and said we would try to remove people from death row where we can. So immediately the day that I was sworn in on December 7th, I promulgated a series of directives that were actually what I call my campaign contract with the community that elected me. And one of those was that we would stop seeking the death penalty. So we immediately stopped seeking the death penalty. We thereafter started to look at cases that were coming back on habeas and other legal processes, and approximately 17 cases now where we are hoping to replace cases that were on the death track for an alternative solution. And as we move forward, one of my goals that we begin to review current cases that are on California death row from LA County, approximately 230, 240, and begin to evaluate cases where we can remove people from death row and get them into another sentencing scheme. And why is that? I've heard people say, well, look, the governor has got a moratorium and the likelihood of an execution here is very slim. Well, I'll tell you the reason why. The reality is that until we abolish the death penalty, there's always a risk, right? We could have a governor that came on board and decided to reenact the death penalty. And, there are actually probably an upwards of 30, 40 people in our death row that have exhausted all their appellate processes. So the reality is that we could actually all of a sudden be facing massive application of the death penalty. And then the other thing, again, going back to the issues of the cost, the reality is that we are taking so much money in maintaining California death row because of the way that people that are on death row have to be housed and the whole complexity of the system. That is money that could be going to education, public health. There's so many other ways that it's just doesn't make any sense whatsoever to continue to have a death row. And where I can, given that we're the largest county in the state and have the largest population as a group of people that are on death row, my goal is to remove as many as we can from that process. So that's sort of what we're doing in LA. And, I'm hoping that perhaps the Supreme Court will agree with us in the near future. And maybe this will become, the death penalty will become part of the history of the state, not the good history, but it will be relegated to the history books, and that we move on to be a much more humane society.
Thank you, George. We're grateful to have someone articulating those kind of values leading the largest office of prosecution in the state and perhaps in the country. We'll come back to several of the issues that you raised. I want to turn to Rabbi Brous. There's never been a moment when I've been in her presence that I haven't been inspired, that I haven't learned something. So I'm eager for your broad and deep perspective on this issue of ending the death penalty.
Thank you, Steve, and Herman and George. I'm so deeply moved by all that you've shared so far, and really looking forward to this to this discussion. I want to say that I have heard a lot in the course of the last couple of years that our criminal justice system is not broken, that it's working exactly as it was designed to work. And one of the things that we know is that if change is going to happen, it's only going to be because of real visionary leadership. And we're just so blessed here in Los Angeles to have such visionary leadership, and having a real progressive DA, it really makes a difference. And so I'm so grateful to you. And all eyes are on LA right now. And I know that there comes with a great weight on the shoulder with that. But I just thank you for carrying these values with you to work every single day. And many of us are really deeply, deeply grateful to you, George, for your incredible leadership here. Steve Rohde just wrote a great piece in Ms. Magazine called "The Feminist Case for Ending the Death Penalty." And Steve, in that piece, you quoted Representative Ayanna Pressley, who said in 2019 that the death penalty has no place in a just society. And so I want to just speak very briefly to this, because I come to this issue as a faith leader, as someone who really roots my core values in an ancient wisdom. And I want to take a moment to show us that the abolitionist imperative is not a radical leftist political agenda that has emerged in the last couple of years, but is really deeply rooted and is thousands of years old. It is rooted very much in my faith tradition and in our ancient texts. So first, initially, some might say that, in fact, the Hebrew Bible does actually permit the death penalty. And it's true that in the 24th chapter of the book of Leviticus, it says that if a person kills another person, surely that person shall die. And what's interesting about that is that it is not read in my Jewish tradition in a literal and direct way. Instead, the rabbis, who have an incredibly profound fidelity to the biblical text, create obstacle after obstacle to preclude the death penalty from actually being implemented in any circumstance. And so very famously, our ancient code of law, the Mishnah, which is codified around the year 220 CE, articulates that a court that would execute even one person in 70 years would be considered a court with blood on its hands. And several of the great rabbis who are part of that discussion say that had they been members of the high court, they would have abolished the death penalty altogether, because it's not even worth taking the risk. And I think this is such an interesting, such an interesting thing for us to pay attention to. The biblical text clearly grants the human community permission to uphold capital punishment, but their moral compass could not abide it. And so instead, they do everything that they can to place limits on human power, because they know that all justice systems, even biblical justice systems, are vulnerable to human weakness. And they understand, as several of our speakers already have said this evening, that we cannot bear to live in a society in which flawed human beings with flawed legal and social structures might accidentally, inadvertently take the life of an innocent being. They understood that when human lives are on the line, there's simply too much at stake to take that risk. And I just want that to sink in for a moment, because these texts were written 2,000 years ago. This is the spiritual and the philosophical foundation for the case for abolition of the death penalty. But I shared this at the death penalty focus gathering in the winter. It's not only that they were concerned 2,000 years ago that flawed systems and flawed human judgment would potentially lead to errors in judgment that would result in an innocent person being executed. There's actually more at stake here than just the risk of executing an innocent person. So Herman asked us a couple of moments ago to imagine that we were sitting on a jury that would be responsible for determining his guilt or innocence. You asked us, Herman, to imagine having someone else's life in our hands. Our rabbis actually record in the Mishnah, in this code of law, that recognizing what's at stake in such a case when we stand in judgment of one another is absolutely critical. And what they do is lay out the exhortation that the judges would have to offer to the witnesses in every capital case in order to make sure that the witnesses would understand exactly what's at stake. And what they choose to share is very telling. They say that every single human being is created, B'Tselem Elohim in the Hebrew, is created in God's own image, which meant that they and that all of us have innate dignity. For a moment, the judges insist that the witnesses contemplate that the person who they are called to testify against actually holds innate human dignity. And that dignity manifests itself in three distinct ways. Number one, we have to know that every single person has infinite value and inestimable worth, even people who commit even terrible crimes. And here's where the rabbis say, in words that are echoed in the Quran, actually, years later, if you destroy a single life, it's as if you destroy an entire world. If you end up testifying in a way that this person is executed, a whole entire world will be destroyed, because that person's reverberations, that person's procreative reverberations and reverberations through their teachings and through their example will be cut short, and that will be on you. They also say that all people are created equally and must be treated equally. And a system that fails to treat every single person as equal is a failed system. And they say that every single person has a unique story to tell in this world. And so when one person dies, even a person who's committed a terrible offense, the world is bereft because they will no longer have that voice in our chorus of human voices. And finally, our rabbis insist that people change, that redemption is possible, that even people who cause incredible harm can change, that their hearts can be awakened, that they can go on a path of truth-telling and reconciliation, and they can walk toward healing. And those claims are not just abstract theological claims, but those are real human challenges. They're asking us to consider, again, 2,000 years ago, and this echoes true to this moment, what would it mean to build a society in which we actually believe that every single human being is an image of the divine? What if we allowed that core commitment to shape our public policy? What would that mean about our law enforcement, about our criminal justice system, about our policing, where judgment is too often rendered based on whether a person is Black or white or rich or poor, rather than whether a person is guilty or innocent? It's so clear that if we take this seriously, that the full and immediate abolition of this anachronistic, corrupt, and morally anemic system would have to be implemented immediately. So I believe that Ayanna Pressley is right, that the death penalty simply has no place in a just society. And I know, and you know, that we don't yet live in a just society, but that we have a shared commitment to building one, that we have a shared commitment to building a society in which every single person can actually be treated as an image of the Holy One, in which we have a justice system that is truly just, in which we hold every single being with dignity and with tenderness and with love. And that, I believe, is the challenge before us, to translate that dream, that theological abstraction, that core commitment into a real society that is rooted in justice, that is rooted in love, and that is based on the recognition of the full dignity of every single human being. And that is fundamentally inconsistent with the death penalty.
Thank you, Sharon, so much. You never cease to amaze me in your ability to gather lots of history, but bring it down to the present day with such urgency. That's what's important right now. I want to have the four of us come together, and already in the Q&A, there are questions which I'll get to in a moment. I do want to tell the audience that the report that I mentioned, the committee on revision of the penal code, their draft report, which is being finalized, and although they voted unanimously to adopt it, the link to that report is in the chat. It is an extraordinary document because in about 35 pages, it covers so many of the issues we're talking about. But let me turn to you, Herman. In your work, take a few minutes to talk about the kind of outreach that Witness to Innocence and the other programs you're involved in have engaged in to try to communicate these messages to average voters, to average people. What has been your opportunity to sit with people who have been inflamed by calls for law and order, revenge, as you mentioned? When you sit with people, what have you said that you have perceived has had an impact on people that begins to move them away from the punitive model that all too long has pervaded the criminal legal system?
Well, Stephen, we have Witness Innocent. We work with a big area in the society. We even have an A&J where we go to the prosecutors and bring death row exonerees in front of the prosecutors and investigators and things like that. We tell our stories and we go back and forth with questions so they can get an understanding of things. But one of our biggest area is we like to reach out to law students and students that's in school, because those are the future. They are the future jurors. They are the future legislators. They are the future state attorneys, police officers, and things like that. And we want everyone to understand the danger of having the death penalty in our system. It's amazing how we go into forums, and I've ran into situations where people do want to argue about the biblical side of it. The Bible says you should, it's okay to kill and things like that. They have their all different views, but the way I look at it is like this here, is that I do not try to change anyone's views. I try to give them reasons to change their views. A prime example of one of the greatest reasons to change their views is what they're looking at right now. I was lucky. I was one of the lucky ones. And right now we have, I think, 185, 187 death row exonerees in the United States. Now, if we wasn't trying to bring this change about, that's 187 lives that would have been lost. Now, as you were saying, down through the history of executions, we have lost innocent people in that long journey, and we cannot replace those. We cannot, justify what has been done. There's no way to fix it. And the most damaging part about it, we as society allow this death penalty to be intact, allow those executions to come forth, and we created victims. We created victims where the person executed, what about his family, his friends, his son, his daughter that would never see their father, their uncle, their brother, their son? We created that by allowing this death penalty to actually be intact. So us as society, we have to put together now and try to do our best to remove this so that we would no further continue doing what we're doing.
Thank you, Herman. You've mentioned victims a couple times. I discovered a story that is no more powerful. Following the Oklahoma bombing, the father of one of the victims, Bud Welch, he was he was grief-stricken that his daughter was killed in Oklahoma. And the only thing he could think of was revenge. The only thing he could seek was the death of the perpetrators of that bombing. But he reflected on his daughter's opposition to the death penalty. And he thought more and more that the death penalty would not bring back his daughter. And on the night of Timothy McVeigh's execution, Bud Welch, the father of a victim of that crime, was in the only place on the face of the earth he should have been. He was sitting next to Timothy McVeigh's father as they waited for the news of Timothy McVeigh's execution, because Bud Welch had come to see that the death penalty was wrong. It would not bring back his daughter. And he has been a powerful voice. In your activities, Herman, have you seen the victims of murder and their families in particular? And have you talked to, is the victims community monolithic in their support for the death penalty?
Well, we have a lot of organizations now that where family members, victims, where the victims are actually, like a prime example, Susan Boston. Her father was killed in Miami, stabbed. He was a preacher helping out in the community, and somebody that was on drugs came and actually stabbed him up and everything. And she fought to save that person from being the defendant from being executed. You have numerous people that's out there that actually at the beginning they want the death penalty, want it, but then when they find out it's just revenge that they're seeking, and that is not right, you know, they have a change of heart. And I'm sure Mr. DA can, well, he might not relate to it because he's not pushing for the death penalty, but a lot of the family members actually go to the DA office and express now that they don't wish to have the person executed. In fact, I know situations where people actually got to, some of the victim families actually got to know the defendant, writing, corresponding with the defendant, and they found that that person is a human being. And it's just like Mr. D.A. George said, that, you know, most of these crimes are committed through anger, passion, without a thought of a quick reaction, or, you know, or we got, like you say, psychopath, which you have to look at the psychopath as with mental issues that should have been addressed way when they was younger, and that was failed. So, I mean, you have victims, families that's actually out there fighting to end and abolish the death penalty also.
Thank you. George, as we turn back, I want to confirm your sense of the extraordinary cost of the death penalty. Now, many people aren't moved by that. They oppose the death penalty morally, but counties bear these costs. The Legislative Analyst Office estimated 5 years ago in 2016 that eliminating the death penalty would save California $150 million per year compared to the kinds of costs, the trial costs, the appellate costs, the prison costs that's being spent. So you were quite right in that regard. My first question for you, George, is defenders of the death penalty simply say that we've refined the death penalty to killing the worst of the worst, and that public safety requires that we have this ultimate form of punishment. How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, first thing, Stephen, you're right. And, you know, we get victims sometimes that do want to see the death penalty. But the reality is that all the data that we have and all studies after studies, and we go back decades, by the way, clearly show that there's absolutely no evidence that the death penalty serves as a deterrent. So I think even some of those most ardent supporters of the death penalty, at least when they're outside of the camera, they will admit that they recognize that the death penalty is not a deterrent. And so the argument really comes out to punishment, kind of a, sort of an eye for an eye, if you will. And then the question that we have to ask ourselves is that good public policy, right? Is that a good use of our resources? Is that where government should be? And, obviously I don't believe that is the case, but I think that there is so much evidence to support that. And so really what it comes down to for those people that are strongly supporters of the death penalty is that when you get right down to it, and if you push them hard enough, they would tell you that it's about punishing. Somebody committed a horrendous act, which most of the time it is the case, although we know that sometimes, as in the case of Herman and others, there will be a wrongful conviction. But let's admit that, okay, the majority of the cases, the person did murder someone, and in some cases it was really horrific incident that led to that death. But there's no other explanation other than just simply punishing. And it's much like, and I believe it was an op-ed piece that was today or yesterday on death penalty. They say, we don't go around and rape rapists. We don't go around and burn an arsonist's home. This is the only area of the law where we somehow have gotten to the point that we believe that actually doing exactly what this person did to someone else is the way to satisfy our anger, if you will, and our emotions. And I think that while I totally understand, for someone, especially at a moment in time, you may have a victim's family that may be angry and emotional and seeking punishment. We as the state and as a society need to make sure that decision-making process that leads to accountability steps aside from that primal force that we all at some point may feel, sort of that that retribution for the sake of retribution. And so that really, when you talk to those supporters of the death penalty, once you peel the onion, it really comes down to strictly punishment. And the question is, as a society, are we in the business of punishing people? I believe that we're not. We're there to hold people accountable. We're held to make sure that we protect our community, and sometimes that protection requires that we incapacitate, that we remove people away from our society because they're dangerous. But we should not be focusing on that just purely because it's punishment or retribution.
Thank you, George. Sharon, we've spent a lot of time today talking about saving innocent people from death row and the fear of executing an innocent person. From what I know, you are opposed to the death penalty unalterably. You are literally opposed to the death penalty in all instances. Despite any evidence of guilt, you would oppose the death penalty. And I would ask you to frame your justification in opposing the death penalty across the board.
Yeah, this is what I was trying to lay out for us earlier, which is that the reason that many of us oppose the death penalty is not only because of the abhorrent risk of killing an innocent person, but also because we do not believe that it is the right of the state or of a society to take a human being's life, even if that person has committed a terrible crime. And so, we have to find ways of keeping people safe. that are short of taking another person's life. And it's not only because it's irreversible and we might find out afterwards that that was a person who should have been exonerated. It's because we fundamentally believe that the state should not be in the business of killing human beings. And for me, as a person of faith, that's rooted in the very strong belief that every single person is created in the image of God. And we mentioned Stan Tukey Williams earlier, Steve, and I know that you worked very closely on this case, but what we see again and again is that people change and that their lives develop in ways that perhaps they could not have imagined before. And we know that there are many people who are on death row for crimes that they actually did commit, murders that they committed, and 20 or 30 years later, they're different people than they were. And in the case of Stan Tukey Williams, he was writing books and giving lectures and creating films to try to teach kids who were like him 20 years earlier to choose a different path. It serves society much better for a person like that to be alive and able to do the work of demonstrating that redemption is possible than for the state to enact this kind of revenge, the bloodlust that is what the death penalty is fundamentally about. So I believe that our job is to search for and to seek out the presence of God in every single person. And it is not in our hands to determine if a person should live or die.
Sharon, thank you. I'm going to turn and stay with you because we really have some extraordinary questions coming up, and we'll try to cover them as many as we can. One compliments us on our great conversation, but asked a philosophical question. And therefore, this question goes to you, Sharon, since it's a philosophical question. If you believe that a human being has the right to defend itself through violence or killing if necessary, and if you support the military and the right of America to kill enemies that seek to kill Americans, all of those examples I would say are self-defense, then do you not indeed believe in the death penalty? And if not, why?
Because taking the life of a person who is strapped into a chair and no longer poses any threat to anybody is simply not an act of self-defense. That is an act of revenge.
That's as direct an answer as I've ever heard. George, there's a question that if the death penalty is racist, aren't other serious sentences just as racist? Is there a humane way to evaluate incarcerated people and see that their cases are better administered free from racism?
Well, unquestionably, that we know that the criminal legal system is, in this country for sure, is riddled with systemic racism, right? I mean, we have to go back all the way to slavery and see how so much of what we do today is deeply embedded in the institution of slavery and the evolution of slavery in this country up until modern days. So yes, much like the death penalty, almost so much of what we do is so heavily impacted by systemic racism. And that's why our jails and our prisons are so heavily disproportionately populated by African Americans and other poor people of color. And precisely one of the things that myself and I call it a movement because it's really not just me, it's people like many of you, like Rabbi Brous and yourself, Stephen, and others, that we are working together to create a different approach to community safety and to public health in our communities. And one of the central tenets of that conversation is how do we extricate race from the process? How do we look at accountability and how do we look at protecting victims and their rights in our community, and do so in a way that we take race out of the equation, especially in a society where race plays such a central part in everything that we do, right? Whether you're talking about education or you're talking about public health. I mean, we talk about systemic racism in the criminal legal system, but the reality is that you can turn almost in any direction. If you look at our educational system, you look at our public health system, even more recently, just look at COVID. right? And the impact of COVID in communities of color. So it's very difficult, obviously, to sort of single out and get the criminal legal system in a vacuum and try to say we're going to eliminate racism from that system without looking at the role that race plays and race animus plays in our entire society. But I think that one of the differences in when you're talking about the criminal legal system as opposed to some of the other systems is that this is a place where the state plays such a role, and not only in some cases, the ultimate case is taking someone's life, but taking someone's freedom. And so to that end, that's why I'm so committed to bringing restorative justice to the work that we do. That's why I'm so committed to looking at the lowest level of intervention possible in order to achieve the accountability and the protection of our community, but do so in a way that is not overly intrusive. That's why, for me, frankly, science and data and research are so important. And it's always in a journey and a search for what is the most thoughtful way of intervening to protect our community, but also to protect everyone else involved, including the subject of the attention of the criminal legal system in a way that understands the vulnerability of our system, our vulnerability as human beings, and how our own prejudice, our own insecurities, and try to as much as we can filter those things out and look as purely as we can how we can achieve safety for our community and accountability in a way that provides a modicum of true justice. And that's what I try to do, and many others,
Let me stay with you, George, because there's a very provocative question which asks, we hardly ever hear about guilty prosecutors being held accountable. There are documented examples of prosecutors using false evidence, false scientific evidence, perjured testimony, extracting false confessions, which the police do. But we don't hear about holding prosecutors accountable. Now, that's a tough question for me to ask a prosecutor, but it's easy because I cannot conceive of you ever being in those circumstances. Are you aware of the right and opportunities to hold prosecutors accountable, or has the system wrapped them in various immunities that preclude that?
No, and this is a constant struggle for me, and frankly, it's a struggle for me today more so than in the past, because we're often looking at cases that are coming back years later, where an appellate court, all the way up to the Supreme Court, may send a case back because they have found evidence of prosecutorial misconduct. And usually those cases are decades old. And one of the things that I wrestle with, and I have to say, like San Francisco, and part of it is the scale, but I think also is the posture of the prosecutor's office for decades in San Francisco, as opposed to LA, where LA has had a posture of almost winning at all costs, right? For many years. I think the San Francisco was perhaps blessed by having a series of elected prosecutors in the last few decades that began to look at the work very differently. So while there are some wrongful convictions in San Francisco, the numbers are very, very small in comparison to what we see often coming in LA. And what we see is often that, of course, by the time those cases come back, that individual or those individuals that were part of the prosecution team are no longer around. They have retired, they're gone because so many years have gone by. But it's a struggle, and then there is a more contemporary reality when you find, a prosecutor that perhaps is hiding evidence or is playing procedural games in order not to be forthcoming in the information that has to be provided. And it's a constant struggle for me because we absolutely want to hold those prosecutors accountable. And we also want to deal with the culture within the organization that has rewarded, or perhaps if not rewarded, sort of provided kind of a wink and a nod to that bad behavior, because the concept that maybe this person didn't commit this crime, but he or she must be good for other crimes. Therefore, you know, this is the one that you got him on, right? Which is a very unfortunate way of looking at our work, and often you see police officers and prosecutors, you know, taking that attitude. It's like almost, okay, we're dealing with people that are constantly committing crimes, and you know, maybe this one is not the crime that they really committed, but we're going to make sure that we get them this time because we can, not because we should, or we have the right evidence. And I do believe that until we start holding prosecutors accountable to make sure that they do the work not only in a lawful manner, but more importantly, an ethical. And for you, Stephen, because you're a lawyer, you will understand this a little more. There are things that we as lawyers can do that are quote unquote lawful, but the ethics of it may be questionable. And so you see myself often fighting fights of procedural game plan when some of these cases are coming back to us in order to be able to keep the integrity of a conviction. So I don't think that we can really, and I believe it was Rabbi Brous who said that the system maybe doesn't need to be reformed. It's rigged the way that it is. We just need to reimagine the system. But I don't think we can reimagine the system without reimagining the role of the prosecutor, and what are the rewards, and what are the you know, the artifacts of what is a good prosecutor.
George, very quickly, are you putting in practice guidelines and guardrails among your prosecutors to ensure that the kind of high standards you've described and the mistakes and failures that have been made elsewhere by prosecutors do not occur in Los Angeles?
So, you know, this is it's an ongoing process for me. And, you know, one of the things that we're doing is, through some of the directives that I put into place, is to really eliminate the reward system, if you will, for number of trials and convictions, by simply providing so many opportunities for seeking, you know, lesser sentence and diversion, and all the things that will, I hope, will create a byproduct that creates greater level of integrity in the system. The other part of it, which is one that we're still working on, is how do we create both a training that speaks to this issue, as well as consequences that will address those that actually decide to violate that process.
Thank you. Sharon, we've talked about life in prison without possibility of parole. Some people call that a second death sentence, that there's a movement to reform LWOP, life in prison without possibility of parole. Other states and other countries have a limited term of years in the case of conviction for murder. What are your views on all that?
Here, I would turn it back to our DA to hear, who certainly has put a lot more thought into what would be the most effective way to both hold people accountable and keep our society safe. But I mean, the principles that I've stated earlier, which apply to the death penalty, certainly apply here too. Do you fundamentally believe that redemption is possible for individuals or not? And what kind of pathway toward redemption do we create? Is our system designed to be punitive, or is it designed fundamentally to be restorative, to help a person recognize, take responsibility for, and then become active and responsible members of a society? And certainly my bias would be clearly toward the latter, but I will turn it back to George, if that's okay, to reflect on that, if you would.
No, you know, I am opposed to life without the possibility of parole, and one of the directives that we have put in place is that we will no longer seek that. You know, there are cases where we're obviously dealing with old convictions where that's the only path, especially when you're unwinding a death penalty case. but there are multiple reasons why I'm opposed to the life without the possibility of parole. Number one, and Sharon, you just hit it right on the nail. If we believe that every human being has a capacity of redemption, then there has to be that opportunity offer, and that's why I believe in indeterminate sentencing, where you, depending on on a murder case, for instance, 25 years to life, an individual has a path towards earning rehabilitation and quite frankly paying the debt back to society by redeeming themselves and becoming a contributor to our society in whatever way that the human being can. Secondly, I think is faulty thinking that one generation should determine what future generations will how they will assess whether someone has been rehabilitated or redeemed. When you seek life without the possibility of parole, what you're doing is you're saying, for all the upcoming generations, I don't believe that you are capable of determining whether this person has already paid their debt to society and whether they should be released. So that's another reason why I'm opposed to the death penalty. And then again, and I go back because I believe that there are many lanes on a highway, and we're always not traveling on the same lane. I like to travel on all of them, but I try to appeal to people that travel maybe in only one of those. Some people oppose these things because of moral reasons. Other people oppose it because the injustices. But there are people that maybe they look at it through an economic lens, right? And again, much like the death penalty, the life without the possibility of parole is an economically broken model, right? Because you get into a place where you have people that are in their 70s or 80s. They're costing the state millions of dollars sometimes per year to be kept in custody without any public safety need any longer. They're obviously not a threat to anyone. So even if you don't believe in redemption or rehabilitation or the immorality of this, just purely looking at it through an economic lens, you may at some point you can put people that are in this place in a out of custody setting where they're going to cost our taxpayers significantly less, and they're not a danger to any one of us. So again, whether it's morality, whether it's the how the system is so loaded in one direction, or whether it's the economic reasons, I think that again, this is much like the death penalty. This is an approach to punishment that I believe is just broken from every angle that you look at it.
Thank you, George. As we begin to move toward wrapping up our program, a lot of questions are aligned with our last element, which is a call to action. And I want to ask Herman, what is your forecast? What steps do you see individually, in your own work, among your colleagues, and among elected officials and others that you interact with? Do you see a path forward in the near future to abolish the death penalty?
I really do, and one of the biggest help for this change, I have to say, is when Brian Stevens brought out the movie Just Mercy. Just Mercy opened doors because you had a lot of governors, screenings was put on for a lot of legislators and prosecutors that the movie was put on screening for. And when they came out of their screening, they had a change of view. Not only that, we had a lot of people, members in society, joining a board, joining organizations, and actually taking part of trying to raise awareness around their community. So when they're stepping to the legislation and in their area, letting them know that they're opposing the death penalty. Also with the surveys being taken around the world all the time and the data that's being issued out, informing people that, that it shows that the death penalty is not great to have intact. So I do see a lot of change compared to when I first returned home in 2009 to now. It's huge. I mean, people are really getting involved with these organizations on these issues, and especially the younger ones, they're really getting aboard, and changes are.
Thank you. So we do have some calls to action tonight. In the closing days of the Trump administration, there was a bloodbath of 13 federal executions. It was abominable. And the people of America elected a president who is opposed to the death penalty. So what we have to do is move campaign promises to action. So today, the organizations that have convened this event, ICAR, Death Penalty Focus, and Witness to Innocence, are asking everyone within our voice and those who see this on a recording to call on Merrick Garland to impose a cease the use of federal executions. We call on Joe Biden publicly to call for the commutation of all federal death sentences that are within his power. And you can contact the White House and the Department of Justice to support those steps and the ultimate abolition of the death penalty with the bills that are pending before the House of Representatives under Representative Presley, as Sharon mentioned, and Dick Durbin in the Senate. You can talk and contact your elected officials, senators and representatives, and urge them to support on the federal level the repeal of the federal death penalty. This would go a huge step forward to be joined by the majority of states that have abolished the death penalty in law or in practice. Here in California, I began by alerting you to the Committee on the Revision of the Penal Code. That report will now go to the state Senate and the state Assembly. I will talk about interim measures in a moment because it's very important what we do between now and the abolition of capital punishment. But in our system, only the people in a ballot measure have the power to abolish the death penalty under the California Constitution. In recent times, there have been 2 initiatives to achieve that purpose, and they lost by very small margins. But we believe that times are changing. People are listening to the kind of information you've heard tonight. The state legislature can put a ballot measure directly on the ballot. Otherwise, it takes grassroots organizing to collect signatures to put a measure on the ballot. And we at Death Penalty Focus learned that it can cost up to $2 million to pay private signature gatherers up and down California to get those signatures to put it on the ballot. The legislature and the governor have it within their power to put it on the ballot. And so we ask you to reach out to your elected representatives in the Assembly and in the Senate to take up the committee report, to consider the unanimous decision and the scholarly evidence and factual evidence that demonstrates the irredeemable flaws in the death penalty system. In the interim, the committee went farther and they recommended several steps be taken, that we award clemency to commute death sentences, that we settle pending legal challenges to capital sentences, that we recall death sentences, which George Gascon was talking about under the penal code, that we limit felony murder special circumstances where someone who was not responsible for the murder is held to the highest penalty, that we restore judicial discretion to dismiss special circumstances, that we amend the Racial Justice Act of 2020 to make it retroactive so that anyone who's been the victim of any racial bias or prejudice in their conviction can raise that in a new motion, and that we remove people who are permanently mentally incompetent from death row. Those are the unanimous interim recommendations of the Committee on the Revision of the Penal Code. I believe the time has come. I think we can unite around these issues. I think as much as there has been a reckoning on racial justice in this country, a reckoning on the death penalty is far overdue. I'm so grateful tonight for the presence of Herman, Lindsey, and George Gascon and Sharon Brous, who wake up every day to try to bring more justice and equality to our system. And I'm grateful to each one of you for attending this seminar. This seminar will be posted at ICAR, at Witness to Innocence, and at Death Penalty Focus. If you know anyone who was unable to join us today, please send them to those organizations so that they can participate and experience the kind of compassion and information and foresight that we've heard tonight. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rabbi Brous.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I just want to say I'm so deeply grateful to the folks at Death Penalty Focus and at Witness to Innocence for really leading this fight. I know that Mike Farrell is here tonight with us, and Sarah Timmerman, Ed Redlick, and a number of others who've been in this battle for decades. And so it feels like this really is an inflection point. This is a moment. My friend, Reverend Michael Ray Matthews, says, if you are not cultivating your own moral imagination, then you're probably living inside of someone else's. And I think what's becoming very clear in America today is that we have been living inside of someone else's failed moral imagination for too long. And this is the moment for us to really be audacious in our reimagining of what's possible. And I'm deeply grateful to all of you for joining in this conversation. Herman, God bless you. May you continue to be strong and healthy. I'm so grateful that you are alive and that your voice is part of this conversation and you can give testimony to what you've experienced. To our DA, George Gascon, we have immeasurable gratitude to you for fighting this fight every single day. And I hope you know that there are many, many people who are standing behind you and supporting what you're doing. And to Steve Rohde, my friend, thank you. Bless you. We continue the fight, friends. Have a good evening.